Chapter 78. Clayman's Arrogance and Miscalculations. The atmosphere within the grand hall of Walpurgis was thick with tension. A gathering of demon lords was a rare and ominous event, one that had not been called for centuries without bloodshed following in its wake. And yet, amid the silent calculations of the most powerful beings in existence, one voice rang out with unshakable arrogance. Clayman, seated among his peers, the self-proclaimed marionette master exuded an air of confidence that teetered between bravado and sheer delusion. He had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to manipulate this very meeting into existence. He had set plans into motion, calculated every move, convinced himself that the pieces had fallen exactly as he had intended. This was his moment, or so he believed. With an almost theatrical flair, Clayman rose from his seat, his voice carrying an exaggerated confidence that bordered on condescension. His eyes scanned the gathering, pausing only briefly on those he considered beneath him before fixating on his true target, Rimuru Tempest. "This farce has gone on long enough," Clayman declared, his tone dripping with disdain. "We have gathered here today to address the grave offense committed by this so-called new demon lord. A mere slime dares to take the title that is meant only for the greatest among us? It is an insult to our existence." He let his words hang in the air, expecting murmurs of agreement. He anticipated that his accusations, laced with feigned indignation, would steer the council toward his desired outcome, Rimuru's condemnation. Yet silence followed. No murmurs of approval, no nods of agreement. The other demon lords merely watched, analyzing, calculating, and, in some cases, barely containing their amusement. The first to react was Guy Crimson, the oldest and most powerful of the demon lords. Lounging in his seat, he lazily rested his cheek against his fist, his crimson eyes glinting with mild interest, but also unmistakable disdain. "Are you done?" he asked, his voice flat. Clayman's smirk faltered ever so slightly, but he pressed on. "I speak only the truth. This creature is no demon lord. He is a pretender, a nuisance that must be removed before he destabilizes the very balance we uphold." Still no agreement came. Instead, a slow, soft chuckle echoed from the opposite side of the room. Malim Nava. She had remained uncharacteristically silent up until now, but the amusement dancing in her eyes was unmistakable. The childish demeanor she often displayed was absent, replaced with something colder, sharper, knowing. Clayman's hands clenched into fists, irritation flashing across his face. "Malim," he said, his voice softer but more venomous, "you of all people should understand the gravity of this situation." She didn't answer, and that unnerved him. For weeks, he had been convinced that Malim was under his control, that the ancient, destructive demon lord, one of the strongest among them, was nothing more than his puppet. After all, hadn't she followed his every command? Hadn't she laid waste to his enemies, serving as his ultimate weapon? And yet, as she sat there, her lips curled in a slight, knowing smile, Clayman felt something unfamiliar creep into his gut. Doubt. His fingers twitched. No. Impossible. He had spent too long orchestrating this, too long manipulating events from the shadows. He had maneuvered his forces, pulled the right strings. There was no way this meeting wouldn't end in his favor. His confidence swelled once more, burying the lingering doubt beneath sheer arrogance. "Perhaps I should remind everyone," he said, straightening, "that power is what determines a demon lord's worth. And I have proven my might. Why, I even had to discipline Malim myself when she overstepped her boundaries." He turned toward her then, fully expecting her to lower her gaze, to cower before him as she had done before. She did not. Instead, Malim simply tilted her head. "Oh," she mused, "is that what you think happened?" Clayman's breath hitched. Something was wrong. He had spent so much time basking in the illusion of control that he had failed to recognize the truth standing before him. The pieces of the game he thought he had been playing were no longer his to control. And worse still, he was the only one who didn't realize it. The other demon lords exchanged glances, some smirking, some outright chuckling at Clayman's growing discomfort. They knew. They had likely known from the moment he had stepped into this room, and they had been waiting for him to bury himself deeper. You, Clayman's voice faltered for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The balance had shifted. He had lost control. And the worst part? He didn't know how deep the trap had been set. Key takeaways from Clayman's arrogance and miscalculations. Clayman believed himself to be in complete control, unaware that he was being manipulated in return. He assumed Malim was still his puppet, but subtle hints from her and the other demon lords suggested otherwise. His attempts to turn the council against Rimuru were met with silence and disinterest, proving that his influence was far weaker than he thought. Instead of asserting dominance, Clayman exposed himself as a fool, setting the stage for his inevitable downfall. The tension was rising. Clayman had walked into a room full of predators, believing himself to be the mastermind. But he was not the hunter. He was the prey. Reactions of other demon lords. The moment Clayman's words left his lips, the air within the grand hall of Walpurgis shifted. It was subtle, imperceptible to the untrained eye, but within a room filled with beings of immense power, even the smallest shift spoke volumes. Silence followed his declaration, a silence far heavier than he had anticipated. This was not the silence of contemplation. This was the silence of amusement, of judgment, of waiting. Clayman had stood, spoken, and demanded the floor, but he had miscalculated badly. Now he would reap the consequences. Guy Crimson's amused disdain. The first response came from Guy Crimson, the oldest and most powerful of the demon lords. He did not rise. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the corners of his lips twitching into something that was not quite a smile, but was far from neutral. His crimson eyes glowed faintly in the dimly lit chamber, lazily scanning the room before settling on Clayman. And then, with all the weight of a predator indulging the final struggles of its prey, he spoke. "Are you done?" His tone was neither aggressive nor dismissive. It was bored, and that was far, far worse. Clayman's jaw tensed, his fingers curling slightly into fists. "I am merely stating facts," he replied stiffly. "Surely, Guy, you—" But Guy was already looking away. He had already lost interest. And in this room, losing Guy Crimson's interest meant losing everything. Dino and de Gruel's skepticism. Further down the table, Dino, the so-called lazy demon lord, let out a slow yawn, rubbing his eyes as if the entire ordeal was a nuisance. "Man, I was hoping this meeting would be more exciting, but this is just sad." Beside him, de Gruel, the massive and imposing demon lord of Earth, watched Clayman with a quiet, unreadable gaze. He was a being of few words, preferring to let strength speak over politics. But even he, a lord of pure brute force, seemed unimpressed. "Are we here to fight?" de Gruel asked bluntly, his deep voice rumbling through the hall. Clayman straightened, eager to shift the narrative back in his favor. "That depends," he said, voice regaining some of its former confidence. "If this farce of a demon lord," he gestured toward Rimuru, "refuses to acknowledge his mistake, then yes, a fight may be necessary." Dino snorted. "You're really doing this, huh?" Clayman frowned. "What do you mean?" Dino stretched, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, we all see what's happening here. It's obvious you want to start something. But honestly, you're not as subtle as you think you are." Clayman's composure cracked for just a second. Dino smirked, enjoying the reaction. "Look, man, I don't really care who wins or loses in this little drama of yours. But don't insult our intelligence. You think we haven't noticed? The way you've been pulling strings, trying to turn this meeting into your personal trial." De Gruel nodded. "It's beneath us." And there it was. Not opposition, not anger, disdain. For all his carefully laid plans, for all his maneuvering, Clayman was being treated as a child throwing a tantrum. Ramorous mockery. At the far end of the chamber, Ramiris sat on her floating chair, swinging her legs back and forth. The smallest of the demon lords, her presence was often overlooked by those who failed to recognize her ancient power. But she was far from inattentive. She had been watching Clayman carefully, her bright eyes flickering with amusement. Now she finally spoke. "This is hilarious," she declared, grinning wide. "I mean, I knew you were a schemer, Clayman. But come on, you actually thought you could just waltz in here and get everyone to gang up on Rimuru? That's adorable." Clayman's patience began to fray. "Do you think this is a joke, Ramiris?" "Absolutely," she chirped, no hesitation. "I mean, seriously, look around. Do you see anyone here who's actually taking you seriously? No one's nodding along. No one's agreeing with you. Even Malim's just sitting there, staring at you like you're an idiot." Clayman flinched, despite himself. And, for the first time, he finally looked at Malim. Malim's unsettling silence. The moment Clayman turned to Malim, something inside him twisted. Because she wasn't doing what she was supposed to do. She wasn't nodding. She wasn't backing up his claims. She wasn't showing the submissiveness he had come to expect from her. Instead, she was watching him, unblinking, silent, and, for the first time, he noticed that her eyes were clear. No, Clayman felt the first flickers of genuine panic take hold. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but it was there, the absence of control. He had spent weeks convinced that Malim was his puppet, his greatest weapon. He had orchestrated this entire encounter under the assumption that she would stand by his side. But now, she was staring at him like a stranger. No, worse, like a predator. Clayman swallowed hard. "Malim?" She tilted her head slightly, offering nothing more than a vague, unreadable smile. And that was when he knew. He was alone. The realization of defeat. Clayman had walked into Walpurgis thinking he was the mastermind. He had thought that his words would sway the council, that the other demon lords would see Rimuru as an imposter, an enemy to be dealt with. But now, he was the only one speaking. Every glance, every smirk, every chuckle from the others told the truth he refused to accept. This was not his trial. This was his execution, and he was the only one who didn't know it yet. Key takeaways from the reactions of other demon lords. Guy Crimson dismissed Clayman outright, showing that he held no real authority. Dino and DeGruel saw through Clayman's manipulations and refused to be used. Ramiris openly mocked him, proving just how little credibility he had. Malim's silence was the final warning, signaling that Clayman's illusion of control had already collapsed. Clayman realized too late that he was the prey, not the hunter. This was not the way he had planned for Walpurgis to go. But there was no stopping it now. The end of Clayman had already begun. Unmasking of Clayman's schemes. The suffocating silence that had settled over Walpurgis was broken, not by Clayman's voice, but by a slow, deliberate chuckle. It was not loud. It was not mocking. It was something worse. It was knowing. And it came from Rimuru Tempest. The first fractures in Clayman's facade. Clayman's head snapped toward the source of the sound, his forced composure slipping for just a fraction of a second. Rimuru sat comfortably in his chair, arms crossed, his golden eyes gleaming. Not with anger, not with hostility, but with something far more dangerous. Amusement. "Sorry," Rimuru said, his voice casual, almost lazy. "I was just thinking about how ridiculous this whole thing is." Clayman stiffened. "Ridiculous?" "Yeah." Rimuru shrugged. "You standing up there acting like you're in control. Acting like you actually had a plan." A ripple went through the room. Not a physical one. Not a magical one. But a shift. A change in the way the other demon lords looked at Clayman. Because Rimuru was not defending himself. He was exposing his accuser. The trap springs shut. Clayman's mind raced. No. No. This isn't how it was supposed to go. This was meant to be his moment. His trial, his chance to frame Rimuru as a reckless, unworthy upstart. But now, with just a few words, Rimuru had turned the tables. The spotlight was no longer on Rimuru. It was on him. Clayman swallowed, masking his unease with a scoff. "And what, pray tell, do you find so ridiculous?" Rimuru leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Well, for starters, everything. But mostly the fact that you actually thought you could manipulate this meeting like a child throwing a tantrum." The insult stung. But before Clayman could retort, Rimuru continued. And then there's the fact that you lied to all of us. Clayman froze. The moment the word lied was spoken, the energy in the room shifted again. Several demon lords who had been indifferent before, DeGruel, Dino, even Leon, now focused completely on Clayman. Lying. That was something none of them tolerated. The evidence against Clayman. Rimuru sighed, shaking his head. See, I wasn't going to waste my breath proving you wrong, because I figured everyone here could see through your little act. But since you're so desperate to keep this performance going, let's break it down, shall we? Clayman's fingers twitched, but Rimuru wasn't finished. First, you accused me of being an unworthy demon lord. But the thing is, I never asked for the title. The world itself recognized my strength. Unlike you, I didn't have to spend centuries scheming and begging to be acknowledged. A murmur spread through the council. Guy Crimson smirked. Clayman clenched his fists, but Rimuru continued. Second, you keep acting like Malim is your loyal soldier, but she's sitting right there, looking at you like she's debating whether or not you're worth crushing under her boot. Another murmur. Ramiris giggled. Clayman felt his breath quicken. And third, Rimuru's expression darkened. You tried to wipe out an entire city of innocent people to trigger this little war. And guess what? I have proof. The room fell silent. Clayman stopped breathing. The moment of realization. Clayman had known this meeting would be dangerous. He had known the other demon lords would be skeptical. But he had not expected Rimuru to come with evidence. He had not expected to be called out so publicly. And he had not expected the council to turn against him. His confidence cracked. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He could feel it, the shifting weight of the room, the way the gazes of the demon lords were no longer dismissing Rimuru, but scrutinizing him instead. The way his power, the very influence he had worked centuries to cultivate, was slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers. He was losing them. He was losing everything. The unveiling of the puppet master. And then the final nail in the coffin. A new presence entered the chamber. A man stepped forward, his face hidden behind a lion-shaped mask. Clayman stiffened. His breath caught. No. This wasn't possible. Because standing before him, very much alive, was Carrion, the Beast King. The very ruler Clayman had claimed to have defeated. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the chamber. Dino let out a low whistle. Oof, that's gotta hurt. DeGruel frowned. You told us Carrion was dead. Clayman's blood ran cold. Ramiris clapped her hands together. So you mean Clayman was lying this whole time? Clayman panicked. Wait, this isn't. Guy Crimson grinned. Looks like you were the fraud all along. And just like that, the game was over. Clayman had spent centuries crafting his image as a master manipulator. But now, in the span of minutes, his illusions had been shattered. He was not a genius. He was not a strategist. He was a fool. And everyone in the room knew it. Key takeaways from unmasking Clayman's schemes. Rimuru flipped the trial, turning Clayman from accuser to accused. Lying was Clayman's biggest mistake. The demon lords tolerated violence, but deceit was another matter entirely. Carrion's appearance shattered Clayman's last remaining advantage, exposing his entire scheme. Clayman's influence collapsed, leaving him isolated and powerless. For the first time in his life, Clayman was the one being toyed with, and now there was only one fate left for him. Judgment. Introduction of suspicious figures. The moment that changed everything. The chamber of Walpurgis had already been thrown into chaos. Clayman, once so sure of his own brilliance, now stood frozen, his carefully crafted manipulations crumbling around him. Rimuru had turned his trial into Clayman's own execution, exposing every deception, every miscalculation. And just when it seemed that Clayman's downfall had reached its peak, a new figure entered the stage. The heavy doors to the Demon Lord's council chamber swung open without warning. A shadow loomed over the entrance, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. The tension in the room snapped, because the figure that now stood before them was not supposed to be here. The arrival of the lion-masked man. He was tall, imposing, wrapped in a flowing, regal cloak. His presence exuded power, raw and untamed, like a beast standing on the precipice of a hunt. But the most striking feature, the one that sent shockwaves through the room, was the mask. A lion-shaped mask that concealed his face, its intricate golden engravings gleaming under the dim light of the chamber. For a brief moment, there was only silence. Then came the murmurs. The demon lords exchanged glances, some curious, some wary. But Clayman's body stiffened. His lips parted slightly, though no words came. His mind was racing, a storm of disbelief and dread, because the mask was not unfamiliar to him. No, it was impossible. Couldn't be. This was his victim. This was the one he had declared dead. This was Carrion. And Carrion was standing right in front of him. The demon lords react. It was Guy Crimson who spoke first. Well. His smirk widened, his crimson eyes gleaming with interest. Now this is getting interesting. The Beast King Carrion, the ruler of the Beast Kingdom Eurazania, the one who had supposedly been defeated and slain by Malim herself, at Clayman's command. And yet, here he stood, alive, which meant that Clayman had lied. Again, Dino let out a low whistle. Oof, that's not a great look for you, Clayman. De Gruel frowned, his massive arms crossing over his chest. You told us Carrion was dead. Ramiris clapped her hands together in mock surprise. So you mean Clayman was lying this whole time? Shocking. The way she said it, her voice dripping with exaggerated disbelief, sent another wave of chuckles through the room. But Clayman was not laughing. Clayman's breaking point, the weight of the moment crushed him. His heart pounded against his ribs. His hands clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. This wasn't happening. It wasn't supposed to go like this. Carrion was supposed to be gone. He was supposed to have been wiped from existence, an example of what happened to those who opposed Clayman's plans. Instead, he stood there, tall and unyielding, his masked gaze burning through the distance between them. It was over. Everything Clayman had built, every carefully laid scheme was collapsing around him. And worse still, it wasn't just Carrion. The second arrival, the silent observer. Before Clayman could even begin to piece together his next desperate move, the doors opened again. A second figure entered the chamber. This one was different. Unlike Carrion, who radiated raw strength, this newcomer was quiet, too quiet. Wrapped in a cloak of deep black, their presence was unnerving in its stillness. The air around them seemed to shift, as if the very space they occupied resisted being perceived. Whoever they were, they didn't belong here. Not in Walpurgis. Not among the demon lords. Yet they had come. And just like before, the moment they stepped inside, every demon lord turned their attention toward them. Even Guy Crimson's smirk faded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he regarded the figure with measured curiosity. Rimuru sat forward slightly, analyzing. Even Diablo, normally unconcerned by most things, subtly shifted in his seat, as if silently evaluating the threat. And then, at last, the silent observer spoke. The question that changed everything. A voice, soft yet filled with weight, cut through the silence like a blade. So this is how far it has come. The words were vague, but the implication was anything but. A chill passed through the room, not from fear, but from realization. Whoever this was, they knew more than they should. They weren't just here to watch. They weren't just here to listen. They were here because they had a role to play. And in that moment, one undeniable truth settled over the room. The real game had only just begun. Key takeaways from the introduction of suspicious figures. Carrion's unexpected arrival shattered Clayman's final lie, confirming his deceit. His survival proved that Malim had never truly been under Clayman's control. The second arrival, an unknown figure cloaked in mystery, introduced a new, unforeseen variable. The demon lords, particularly Guy and Rimuru, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. Clayman's panic confirmed that his downfall was imminent. This was no longer a battle of words. This was a battle of consequences. And Clayman was already losing. Rimuru's position among demon lords. The weight of a new title. Rimuru Tempest sat among legends. He had walked into Walpurgis as a newly ascended demon lord, a being who had only recently come into power. He had expected hostility, skepticism, even outright contempt. After all, these were beings who had ruled the world from the shadows for centuries. Godlike entities who dictated the balance of chaos and order. And yet, as the meeting unfolded, as Clayman's lies crumbled, something unexpected became clear. It wasn't Rimuru who was being judged anymore. It was Clayman. And in that shift, Rimuru saw something crucial. He was not being seen as a fraud. He was being seen as a contender. The old hierarchy of the demon lords. To understand the gravity of the moment, one had to understand who Rimuru was sitting among. There were 10 recognized demon lords in existence, each possessing monstrous power capable of shaping the fate of nations. Some had ruled for centuries, others for millennia. Among them, there were clear tiers of strength and influence. The apex lords, the undisputed rulers of the demon lords. Guy Crimson, the oldest, strongest, and most enigmatic demon lord. A walking catastrophe. Malim Nava, the child of the dragon. Unfathomable power in a deceptively innocent form. Leon Cromwell, a cold, calculating ruler with an aura of absolute authority. The established powers. De Gruel, a being of raw, physical destruction, feared even among demon lords. Luminous Valentine, the queen of vampires, a being who had ruled for ages. Dino, mysterious, lazy, yet dangerous when provoked. The weaker or manipulative lords. Ramirez, a wild card, less interested in conquest, but still powerful. Clayman, the schemer, manipulating instead of fighting directly. And then there was Rimuru, a demon lord who had ascended overnight. A being who, mere weeks ago, had not even been acknowledged as a threat. Now, he was seated at their table. How Rimuru was viewed. When Rimuru had first entered the room, there had been doubt. Guy Crimson had watched him with mild curiosity, as if trying to determine if Rimuru was worth his attention. Leon Cromwell had barely acknowledged him, deeming him an unknown variable. De Gruel and Dino had regarded him with neutrality, waiting to see if he was worth anything. Ramirez, already on friendly terms with Rimuru, had been the only one who didn't seem to judge him. But then the trial flipped. Clayman had exposed himself as a fraud, and Rimuru had not only survived, but dominated. He had casually exposed Clayman's deceptions. He had presented irrefutable proof of Clayman's war crimes. He had backed Clayman into a corner without raising a single hand. And just like that, the perception of Rimuru had changed. A new power rises. By the time Carrion revealed himself and Clayman's entire plot crumbled, the way the other demon lords looked at Rimuru had shifted. They were no longer dismissing him. They were assessing him. They were accepting him. Even Guy Crimson, the strongest of them all, was watching Rimuru with a gleam of interest. Not as an equal, not yet, but as a demon lord who had earned his seat. The reality of strength. Of course, acceptance did not mean equality. Rimuru, for all his power, was still at the lower end of the hierarchy. Guy Crimson could wipe out entire civilizations without breaking a sweat. Malim Nava, even while holding back, was still vastly superior to him in raw power. Leon Cromwell, an experienced and calculating ruler, remained leagues ahead in influence. But none of that mattered, because strength alone wasn't the game being played here. Power could be overwhelming, but influence was the real weapon. And Rimuru, in a single night, had demonstrated something far more valuable than raw strength. He was dangerous in a different way. He commanded absolute loyalty from his subordinates. He was intelligent, strategic, and capable of outmaneuvering a master manipulator like Clayman. He had the favor of Malim, whether or not she realized it. And perhaps most importantly, he was unpredictable. Guy Crimson's final acknowledgement. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Guy Crimson chuckled. Rimuru turned his gaze toward him, meeting the legendary demon lord's eyes. For a moment, nothing was said. Then Guy spoke. "I like you." It was not an approval of strength. It was not an offer of friendship. It was something else. Recognition. Guy, the oldest and strongest of the demon lords, saw Rimuru not as a rival, but as someone worth keeping an eye on. Key takeaways from Rimuru's position among demon lords. Rimuru entered Walpurgis as an unknown. He left as a recognized demon lord. He was still one of the weaker members in terms of raw power, but his strategic intelligence made him dangerous. Guy Crimson, the strongest of all, took an interest in Rimuru, which was more significant than any formal acknowledgement. His influence had grown beyond mere strength. He had become a political force among demon lords. Rimuru was not yet a legend, but the path to becoming one had begun, and the true power struggle had only just started. Anticipation of upcoming conflicts. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The halls of Walpurgis still echoed with the aftermath of Clayman's downfall. His schemes had unraveled. His lies had been exposed, and the very council he had tried to manipulate now looked upon him with disgust. But even as the dust settled, Rimuru Tempest knew better than to let his guard down, because something far bigger was happening beneath the surface. And this was only the beginning. The Empire watches from the shadows. Far beyond the demon lords gathering, across vast landscapes and towering cities, there was a force that had yet to reveal itself, the Eastern Empire, a superpower that had ruled with an iron grip for centuries, a nation built on conquest, strength, and unshakable belief in their own superiority. They had watched the events surrounding Rimuru closely. They had heard of his rise to demon lord status. And while Clayman had been little more than a puppet in their grander schemes, his failure meant that they now had to acknowledge Rimuru as a true threat. He had disrupted their plans. He had proven himself to be far more dangerous than anticipated. And soon they would make their move. The demon lords begin to choose sides. Walpurgis had not only been a stage for Clayman's humiliation, it had been a power shift. Rimuru's rise was not something that could be ignored. The balance between demon lords had shifted, and now the others had to decide. Would they support him? Would they ignore him? Or would they try to eliminate him before he became a true rival? Guy Crimson had already acknowledged Rimuru's potential. Malim Nava's loyalty, though unclear, was a powerful factor in itself. But others, like Leon Cromwell and Luminous Valentine, remained distant, watching from the sidelines. Would they align with him, seeing him as a new force worth betting on? Or would they see him as a problem that needed to be eliminated before it was too late? The lines were beginning to form, and soon the demon lords would no longer be neutral. Clayman was only a pawn. Who was the real mastermind? As Clayman crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance, a deeper question had begun to emerge. Who had truly been pulling the strings? Clayman had considered himself a manipulator, but it was clear that he himself had been manipulated. And if that was the case, then who had truly set all of this in motion? The Eastern Empire had its hands in these affairs, yes, but was there someone even deeper in the shadows? A force that had yet to reveal itself? Someone who had orchestrated everything from the beginning? Rimuru was certain of one thing: this was not over. Not even close. Rimuru's next move: preparing for the unknown. As the demon lords' meeting finally drew to a close, Rimuru's mind was already racing with possibilities. He had won this battle, but he would not be caught off guard when the next enemy appeared. The Empire was watching. The other demon lords were recalculating. And somewhere, hidden from sight, was the true mastermind of this war. Rimuru would be ready, because the next conflict would decide the fate of the world itself. Key takeaways from the anticipation of upcoming conflicts. The Eastern Empire has taken notice of Rimuru and will likely make a move soon. The demon lords are beginning to choose sides, shifting the balance of power. Clayman was only a pawn. There is a greater force lurking behind the scenes. Rimuru understands that this was just the first battle, and he is already preparing for the next war. The war had not ended. It had only just begun. And Rimuru Tempest was at the center of it all.